black teenager is arrested by the police without cause, and the officers are sure they've done everything right. But when his powerful father enters the station, the whole situation changes. Will they be able to justify their actions or face dire consequences? Write in the comments how you think it will end, and don't forget to subscribe. The sun was setting over the small town, casting a warm, golden hue across the sky as 16-year-old Jordan Harris walked down the familiar streets towards Oak Ridge Park. It was one of his favorite spots to unwind after a long day at school, a peaceful retreat from the demands of academic life. The soft breeze rustled the trees, and the distant laughter of children playing echoed through the air. Jordan, with his headphones on, was lost in the rhythm of the music as he made his way to meet a few friends. Jordan was the kind of teenager any parent would be proud of. He was smart, responsible, and had a strong sense of justice, values instilled in him by his father, Michael Harris, a highly respected captain in the local police department. Growing up, Jordan had always admired his father's dedication to his work. Despite the long hours and the weight of responsibility that came with the job, Captain Harris was the epitome of what a good police officer should be. Fair, diligent, and always willing to go the extra mile to protect the community. Jordan often dreamed of following in his father's footsteps, though lately he had started to consider a career in law, perhaps as an advocate for those who couldn't defend themselves. He had always felt a deep desire to help others, and this drive guided his actions every day. Whether it was tutoring younger kids at school or participating in volunteer programs around the community, Jordan was known as someone who could always be counted on. As he approached the park, Jordan's thoughts drifted to his relationship with his father. Captain Harris was a man who believed deeply in the justice system, in the idea that laws were there to protect people, no matter their background. He had raised Jordan to believe in these principles too. But as Jordan grew older, he began to notice that reality didn't always align with these ideals. His father was often too busy with work, leaving little time for family, and that had created a small but noticeable gap between them. Jordan admired his father, but sometimes he felt that his dad's commitment to the job came at the expense of their relationship. Entering Oak Ridge Park, Jordan could see clusters of people scattered across the open spaces. Families having picnics, groups of friends tossing frisbees, and kids playing tag around the jungle gym. He smiled, feeling the familiar sense of calm that this place always brought him. But something in the distance caught his attention. Near the basketball courts, a group of boys was gathered, and it didn't take long for Jordan to realize that something was wrong. He recognized two of the boys immediately, Thomas and Eric, kids from his school. They were arguing, their voices loud enough to carry across the park. The tension between them was palpable, and as Jordan got closer, he could see that the argument was about to turn physical. Thomas, taller and more imposing, had his fist clenched, and Eric looked like he was ready to fight back. Jordan knew he had to step in. He couldn't just stand by and watch things escalate into violence. That wasn't who he was. His father had always taught him to de-escalate situations whenever possible, and Jordan believed that this was one of those times. "Hey, what's going on here?" Jordan called out, jogging over to the group. His voice was calm but firm, the way he'd seen his father handle tense situations countless times before. Thomas and Eric both looked at him, their faces flushed with anger. Neither of them seemed to want to back down, but Jordan wasn't about to let this turn into a full-blown fight. "Come on, guys," Jordan continued, stepping between them. "Whatever this is about, it's not worth fighting over. Let's talk it out, all right?" For a moment, it seemed like his words had reached them. Both boys hesitated, glancing at each other, their fists loosening slightly. But before the situation could fully diffuse, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Jordan turned to see a police cruiser pull up on the grass near the basketball courts, its lights flashing. Two officers quickly exited the vehicle and started toward the group. Jordan's stomach tightened. He hadn't called the police, and he certainly didn't expect them to arrive this quickly. Someone must have called them when the argument first started. As the officers approached, Jordan raised his hand slightly, trying to show that everything was under control. "It's all right, officers," Jordan said, his voice steady. "I was just trying to calm them down. There's no need for—" "Step aside," one of the officers barked, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. His name tag read Officer Daniels, and his face was etched with impatience. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence radiated authority. But there was something else, too, an air of aggression that Jordan instantly picked up on. The second officer, whose name tag read Officer Turner, had already sized up the situation. He looked past Jordan and immediately focused on him, as if deciding right then and there that Jordan was the one causing the trouble. "Hands where we can see them," Turner ordered, his voice sharp. Jordan frowned, confused. "I'm not." "Now," Daniels shouted, stepping forward and grabbing Jordan by the arm, roughly pulling him aside. "Wait, what are you doing?" Jordan exclaimed, trying to explain himself. "I was just trying to stop them from fighting. I didn't do anything." The officers weren't listening. Their focus was entirely on Jordan, as if they had already made up their minds about him. Turner stepped closer, his expression hard and accusatory. "We got a call about a disturbance here," Turner said, his eyes narrowing as he looked Jordan up and down. "You fit the description." "What description?" Jordan asked, his heart racing. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, and for the first time he felt a flicker of fear. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Daniels wasn't interested in explanations. "You want to argue with us, kid? Hands on your head now," he barked, moving aggressively toward Jordan. Before he could react, Daniels yanked his arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Jordan winced in pain, his mind racing. What was happening? How had everything escalated so quickly? He hadn't done anything wrong, but these officers were treating him like a criminal. Thomas and Eric stood frozen nearby, unsure of what to do. The situation had spiraled out of control in a matter of seconds, and Jordan found himself in handcuffs, being pushed toward the police cruiser. "I didn't do anything," Jordan shouted again, but his words fell on deaf ears. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace and resisting arrest," Turner said coldly as he shoved Jordan into the back of the cruiser. Jordan's mind was spinning. Disturbing the peace? Resisting arrest? He had only tried to help. How had this happened? His thoughts raced back to the lessons his father had taught him about respecting the police, about the importance of following the rules. But this was different. They weren't listening. They weren't giving him a chance. As the cruiser sped away from the park, Jordan sat in the back seat, staring out the window in disbelief. He was innocent, but none of that seemed to matter now. The officers had already made up their minds about him, and nothing he said or did was going to change that. Back at the station, Jordan was led into the holding area, still in handcuffs. His heart pounded in his chest as he was roughly pushed into a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The door closed behind him with a loud click, leaving him alone to face whatever was coming next. He sat there, his hands still trembling from the shock of what had just happened. He had always believed that the system was there to protect people like him, people who did the right thing. But now, sitting in that cold, empty room, Jordan wasn't so sure anymore. And somewhere deep inside, fear began to give way to anger. Jordan didn't know how long he had been sitting there when the door finally swung open and he saw a familiar face enter the room. It was his father, Captain Michael Harris, and for a brief moment Jordan felt a surge of relief. His dad was here. Surely he would fix this. Surely he would understand. But as Michael's eyes met Jordan's, the look on his father's face wasn't one of relief or understanding. It was confusion, concern, and something else Jordan couldn't quite place. "What happened?" Michael asked, his voice low and steady, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that Jordan hadn't expected. "I didn't do anything," Jordan blurted out, his voice tight with frustration. "I was trying to stop a fight, and they just arrested me." Michael's eyes flicked toward the door, where Officer Daniels and Officer Turner stood, their arms crossed, watching the exchange with cold indifference. "We got a report about a fight in the park," Daniels said, his voice flat. "He was part of it." "No, I wasn't," Jordan protested, standing up from the chair, his hands still shaking. "I was trying to help." But the officers weren't budging. Michael turned back to his son, his expression hardening. "Jordan, let me handle this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jordan sat back down, his heart sinking. His father was here now, but something told him that things weren't going to be as simple as he had hoped. The walls of the small, dimly lit interrogation room seemed to close in around Jordan as he sat there, his pulse pounding in his ears. The shock of his arrest hadn't worn off yet, and the confusion swirling in his mind only grew as his father, Captain Michael Harris, stood quietly across from him, deep in thought. Michael hadn't said much since entering the room, but the tension between them was palpable. Jordan had always looked up to his father, the man who wore his badge with pride, who believed in justice and fairness. But now, sitting in that cold, unforgiving room, Jordan's faith in the very system his father had dedicated his life to was being shaken to its core. He had done nothing wrong. He had tried to help, and yet here he was, handcuffed and treated like a criminal. "I didn't do anything," Jordan said again, his voice hoarse, breaking the heavy silence between them. "I was just trying to stop them from fighting." Michael finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jordan's. There was a flicker of something, doubt, maybe frustration, but he kept his voice steady. "We'll get this sorted out, son. Just stay calm." But how could Jordan stay calm when his entire world was unraveling? "They didn't even listen to me, Dad," Jordan said, his voice trembling with anger. "They just grabbed me like I was some kind of criminal." Michael's jaw tightened. He glanced towards the door, where Officers Daniels and Turner were waiting, their expressions unreadable, but their posture radiating confidence. They had already made their decision about Jordan. To them, he was just another troublemaker who needed to be taken down a notch. And despite Michael's rank and position within the department, Jordan could see the conflict in his father's eyes. "Let me talk to them," Michael said, more to himself than to Jordan. He straightened up, his shoulders tense, and moved toward the door. Jordan watched as his father stepped outside, leaving him alone in the room again. The door closed with a soft click, but to Jordan, it sounded like a prison gate slamming shut. In the hallway outside, Captain Michael Harris faced Daniels and Turner. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. On one hand, he was a father, and his son had been arrested, unfairly from what he had heard. On the other hand, he was a police officer, and his loyalty to the force was ingrained in him after years of service. He had trained men like Daniels and Turner. He had led them into difficult situations, trusting them to make the right decisions. But now the situation felt different. It felt personal. "I want to know exactly what happened," Michael said, his voice sharp but controlled. "From the beginning." Daniels crossed his arms, his face impassive. "We received a call about a disturbance in the park. When we arrived, your son was in the middle of a fight. He resisted when we tried to intervene." Michael's brow furrowed. "He resisted?" Jordan said he was trying to stop the fight, not participate in it. Turner, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his tone defensive. "Captain, with all due respect, when we arrived, your son was in the middle of it. He wasn't exactly cooperative when we told him to stand down." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Did you ask him what was going on, or did you just assume?" "We didn't have time for that," Daniels replied, his voice growing impatient. "There were other kids there, tensions were high, and we needed to get control of the situation." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. He knew that tensions could escalate quickly in volatile situations, but this didn't sound like the full story. It sounded like they had made a snap judgment, one that had led to his son being unjustly arrested. "I want to speak to the witnesses," Michael said firmly. "I want statements from everyone who was there." Turner shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, we followed protocol. We handled the situation." Michael's eyes flashed with anger. "Handling the situation and arresting the wrong person are two very different things, Officer Turner." The officers exchanged a glance, their posture stiffening. They weren't used to being questioned like this, especially not by someone like Captain Harris. But this wasn't just about Jordan anymore. Michael knew that this incident went beyond his son. It was about the system he had trusted, the system he had helped build. And now that system was turning against him and his family. "We'll get the statements," Daniels muttered, his voice cold, "but I don't think it's going to change anything. We followed the book." Michael stared at him, his jaw set. "Then you better make sure that book's not broken." With that, he turned away, leaving the two officers behind as he walked back into the interrogation room. He found Jordan sitting in the same spot, his head lowered, his hands still trembling slightly from the shock of it all. Michael wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be all right. But the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. The hours that followed were agonizingly slow. Michael worked tirelessly, going through the proper channels to get witness statements, speaking to other officers and trying to piece together what had really happened in the park. But everywhere he turned, he was met with resistance. The officers involved were sticking to their story, and even the few witnesses who had seen the incident were hesitant to come forward. They had seen what had happened, but the fear of retaliation from the police kept them silent. Jordan sat in a holding cell, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything. He had always believed that his father's badge stood for something: fairness, justice, protection. But now, that same badge felt like a barrier, something that separated him from the truth, from being heard. As the hours dragged on, Jordan's anger began to simmer beneath the surface. It wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about how easily the system had turned against him. And the worst part was that he knew this wasn't an isolated incident. He had heard stories from friends, from classmates, about how they were treated differently, about how being a young black man meant that you were automatically suspect in the eyes of the police. Now it was happening to him. And his father, the man he had always believed would protect him, was caught between two worlds: the world of the police force he had served for decades, and the world of his son, who was now at the mercy of that same force. Later that evening, Michael returned to the station, exhaustion etched into his face. He had spent hours trying to convince his superiors to release Jordan, but it was as if every door he knocked on had been slammed shut. The department was circling the wagons, protecting their own, and Michael knew that if he kept pushing, he would be seen as betraying the brotherhood of the badge. But this wasn't just about the badge anymore. Michael walked down the hallway to Jordan's cell, where his son sat on the cold metal bench, his head resting against the wall. He looked up as his father approached, the hope that had once been in his eyes now replaced by a simmering anger. "They're not gonna let me go, are they?" Jordan asked quietly, his voice thick with frustration. Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Jordan let out a bitter laugh, his hands clenching into fists. "Working on it? Dad, you're a captain. You should be able to get me out of here." Michael's chest tightened. "It's not that simple, Jordan. There are procedures." "Procedures?" Jordan snapped, standing up from the bench. "What about justice? What about doing what's right?" Michael's expression darkened. "I'm trying to do what's right, Jordan, but you have to understand, this is bigger than just—" "No," Jordan interrupted, his voice rising. "This is exactly what's wrong with the system. You've been telling me my whole life that the police are here to protect us, but look at where I am. You can't even protect your own son from your own officers." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Michael stood there, unable to respond, because deep down he knew that Jordan was right. He had spent years building a career in the force, trusting in the integrity of the system, but now, when it came to his own family, that same system was failing him. Jordan paced the small cell, his emotions raw and unfiltered. "I've seen this happen before, Dad. To my friends, to kids at school. They get stopped for no reason, searched, treated like criminals just because of how they look. And now it's happening to me." Michael watched his son, his heart breaking at the anger and disillusionment in Jordan's voice. He had always known, on some level, that this kind of thing happened, that young black men were often unfairly targeted by the police. But he had never thought it would happen to his own son, and now that it had, he felt powerless. "What do you want me to do?" Michael asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. Jordan stopped pacing and looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and resolve. "I want you to stand up for me, not just because I'm your son, but because this is wrong. You're always talking about justice and fairness. Well, now's your chance to actually do something about it." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed in doing the right thing and standing up for what was just. But this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. And the weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. "I will," Michael said finally, his voice steady. "I'll stand up for you. I'll do whatever it takes." By the time morning came, Michael had made up his mind. He knew that pushing against the system wouldn't be easy, and that it would come with consequences, but he couldn't sit by and watch his son suffer because of a broken system. He had spent years building his career, earning the respect of his colleagues, But now all of that seemed insignificant in comparison to the fight ahead. He was going to get Jordan out. And he was going to make sure that this never happened again, to his son or to anyone else. As Michael prepared to meet with his superiors once again, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Jordan, he was fighting for justice, for fairness, for all the young men who had been treated unfairly by the system. And for the first time in his career, Michael Harris realized that doing the right thing might mean going against everything he had ever known. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the town as Captain Michael Harris stood at the entrance of the police station, a heavy sense of determination settling over him. His mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead, the weight of his decision pressing down on him with every step he took. He knew that the path he was about to take would challenge everything he had built over the years. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Jordan, his son, and the injustices that young men like him faced every day. And now, Michael had the power to change that, even if it meant standing against the very system he had sworn to uphold. Inside the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers moved about their duties, but there was an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there before. Word had spread quickly about Captain Harris's son being arrested, and the whispers and sideways glances hadn't stopped since. Michael could feel the eyes on him as he made his way toward the chief's office, his jaw set in determination. Today was the day he would make a stand. As he entered the chief's office, Michael was met with the familiar stern gaze of Chief Richards, a man who had been his mentor for years. Richards was an old-school officer, someone who believed in the chain of command and the importance of loyalty to the badge above all else. But today, Michael wasn't here as just another officer under his command. He was here as a father fighting for justice. "Captain Harris," Chief Richards greeted him, motioning for him to take a seat. "I've heard about the situation with your son." Michael sat down, his back straight and his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yes, sir. That's why I'm here." Richards leaned back in his chair, studying Michael carefully. "I understand this is a difficult situation for you, but I want to remind you that we have protocols in place for a reason. Your son was arrested following procedure, and we're handling it as we would any other case." Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't just about procedure. My son was wrongly arrested based on assumptions made by Officers Daniels and Turner. They didn't investigate, they didn't listen to witnesses, and they used unnecessary force. This isn't the way our department should operate." Richards raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "You're suggesting that my officers acted inappropriately?" "I'm not suggesting it, sir," Michael replied, his voice firm. "I'm stating it as a fact, and I'm asking for a full investigation into their conduct." The tension in the room thickened. Richards stared at Michael for a long moment before leaning forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Michael, you've been a good officer, one of the best, but I hope you understand the gravity of what you're asking for. You're essentially accusing your fellow officers of misconduct. That's not something we take lightly." Michael met Richards' gaze without flinching. "I understand that, but this goes beyond loyalty to the badge. This is about justice. I can't stand by and let this happen to my son or to anyone else." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of years of shared experiences and unspoken words. Finally, Richards let out a sigh and leaned back in his chair again. "You realize this could stir up a lot of trouble," Richards said quietly. "For you, for your family, and for the department." Michael nodded. I know, but it's the right thing to do. Richards studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. All right, I'll authorize the investigation, but I hope you're ready for what comes next. I am, Michael replied, his voice steady. Thank you, sir. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Michael worked tirelessly to gather witness statements and evidence, piecing together the events of that fateful evening in the park. His persistence began to pay off as more witnesses came forward, corroborating Jordan's story that he had been trying to stop the fight, not participate in it. It was clear that Officers Daniels and Turner had acted on their biases, assuming the worst about Jordan simply because of the color of his skin. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Daniels and Turner began to mount. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed that Jordan had indeed tried to intervene in the fight, and that the officers had ignored other potential suspects to focus solely on him. It was damning evidence, and Michael knew that the tide was beginning to turn in their favor, but the real turning point came during a public town hall meeting organized by the community in response to the incident. The meeting was packed with concerned citizens, many of whom had experienced similar treatment at the hands of the police. Michael had been hesitant to attend, knowing that tensions were high and that his presence might be seen as a threat. But Jordan had insisted. "We need to be there, Dad," Jordan had said. "People need to hear the truth." And so they went. As they entered the crowded hall, all eyes turned to them. There was a moment of silence as the community recognized the captain of the police department and his son, who had become the symbol of the struggle against injustice in their town. Michael felt a pang of anxiety, unsure of how they would be received, but Jordan walked confidently beside him, his head held high. The meeting began with testimonies from community members who had experienced racial profiling and mistreatment at the hands of the police. Their stories were heartbreaking, and Michael listened with a heavy heart as they recounted incidents of being stopped, searched, and treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. It was a stark reminder of the systemic problems that existed within the very institution he had dedicated his life to. Finally, it was Jordan's turn to speak. He stood at the front of the room, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he looked out at the faces of the people who had come to support him. Michael watched his son with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing how much this moment meant to him. "I've always believed in justice," Jordan began, his voice strong and clear. "My dad raised me to believe that the police are here to protect us, to keep us safe. But a few days ago I found out that's not always the case." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I was arrested for something I didn't do. I was trying to stop a fight, and instead I was treated like a criminal. The officers who arrested me didn't ask questions. They didn't listen to what really happened. They saw a black kid and assumed the worst." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But this isn't just about me," Jordan continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "This is about all of us. About every kid who's ever been stopped for no reason, about every parent who's had to have the talk with their child about how to stay safe around the police. This has to stop. We need to change the way things are done, and that starts with holding people accountable." The crowd erupted in applause, and Michael felt a swell of pride in his chest as he watched his son stand up for what was right. As the applause died down, Jordan turned to look at his father, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Michael stood up and joined him at the front of the room. He hadn't planned to speak, but the moment demanded it. "I've been a police officer for over 20 years, Michael began, his voice filled with emotion. "And I've always believed in the importance of fairness and justice. But the truth is, our system is broken. My son was arrested because of the color of his skin, and that's not something I can ignore. I'm not just here as a captain of the police. I'm here as a father, as a member of this community. And I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to make sure this never happens again." The room erupted into cheers, and Michael felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt like he was doing the right thing, not just as a father, but as an officer of the law. In the weeks that followed, the investigation concluded, and Officers Daniels and Turner were found guilty of misconduct. They were suspended from the force, their actions condemned by both the police department and the community. The victory was bittersweet for Michael and Jordan. Justice had been served, but the wounds left by the incident would take time to heal. But it was a start. Michael and Jordan didn't stop there. They worked together to create a new program within the department, one that focused on community engagement and bias training for officers. The program was designed to bridge the gap between the police and the people they served, to ensure that no one would ever be treated the way Jordan had been. The road to rebuilding trust was long, but Michael and Jordan were determined to see it through. Together, they became a symbol of hope in their town, father and son united in their fight for justice. And as they stood side by side at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community policing center, Michael looked over at Jordan with pride in his eyes. "You did good, son," he said quietly. Jordan smiled. "We did good, Dad." And for the first time in a long time, Michael believed it. They had faced the storm together, and now they were ready to build something better. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that will make you think. Click on the bell to be the first to know about new videos. In the meantime, watch this video, which we have specially selected for you. We are sure you will like it. Click here and enjoy the next story.